I wanted to have an honest conversation about what it feels like to struggle with trading for a long time. Because after enough failed attempts, you stopped asking what is wrong with trading and start asking what is wrong with you. Every time my trading fell apart, the explanation was basically the same. I needed more discipline and more patience. And honestly, it made sense. Because most of the time, I already knew what I was supposed to do. I knew which setup I was waiting for and where the stop belonged. But knowing it did not stop me from doing the opposite. I would wait for hours, then enter something that was not fully valid because I did not want the session to end with nothing. Or I would take the correct trade, watch it move slightly against me, and suddenly the stop I had tested hundreds of times felt wrong. Afterward, the mistake looked obvious. The strategy was written down and the rules were clear. And I was the person who ignored them. So naturally, I blame myself. Every piece of trading psychology content confirmed it too. The profitable trader stays patient and follows the plan regardless of how he feels. And every time I failed, I reached the same conclusion. I was still not that person. After enough years, that idea starts becoming dangerous. Because you stop seeing the mistake as something that happened under specific conditions, you start treating it as evidence of who you are. Maybe I was too emotional for trading. Maybe some people were built for this and I was not one of them. So every time that version of me showed up again, I tried to replace him. I wrote stricter rules and made longer checklists. Then I created consequences for breaking the plan. If I took something invalid, I would stop trading. The thinking was simple. If the mistake hurt enough, maybe I would finally stop making it. And every new attempt came with this strange feeling of relief. Because the previous account belonged to the old version of me. The new one was clean. There were no losses attached to it. And nothing on the chart reminded me of what had already gone wrong. So following the rules felt easy again. I could wait without forcing anything and take a loss and leave it alone. And for a while, I would genuinely believe I had changed. That was what kept confusing me, because it was not like I had zero discipline. Sometimes I traded exactly the way I wanted to for weeks. So I kept thinking the answer was somewhere inside that better version of me. I just needed to make him permanent. I tried journaling more and reading my rules until they felt impossible to forget. And all of it helped while nothing important was happening. It is easy to believe you have changed when the account is fresh, and one mistake will not cost you anything meaningful yet. Then the pressure returned. A losing period lasted longer than expected. The account moved close enough to the limit that the extra results started to matter. And rules that looked obvious while I was calm suddenly felt negotiable again. The old behavior came back with better explanations. It felt like I was adapting to what the market was doing. And once the account was gone, everything became obvious again. I would look back at the decisions and wonder how I had managed to justify them. Then the promises started. Next time, I would wait. Next time, I would not let one bad period change the way I traded. And because those promises were made after the pressure had disappeared, they felt completely believable. The problem appeared later. One version of me wrote the rules after reviewing everything calmly. Other version had to follow them while watching real money move against him. And I kept expecting both versions to make the exact same decision. Sometimes they did. Sometimes the calm version stayed in control for a long time. But eventually, the trade in front of me felt more convincing than the promise I had made before it. So I would restart again. Another account. Another set of rules. Another attempt to prove that this time I had finally become the right kind of trader. But after repeating that cycle enough times, one question became impossible to ignore. Why did every solution work right until I needed it most? Eventually, I started noticing something strange about the rules I kept breaking. None of them were new. I knew the setup needed confirmation and that one loss did not change anything about the next played entry. But every time the situation appeared, those decisions became open again. The setup would get close to the entry, and I had to convince myself to not take it early. Once I was inside the trade, price would move against me, and I had to convince myself that the stop still belonged where I had placed it. Every answer had already been written down, but the chart kept asking me the same questions, and I kept giving myself another opportunity to answer differently. When I felt calm, the argument barely existed. The setup appeared, I took it, and left everything alone. After a few losses, the exact same decision could feel completely different. The entry had not changed and the data had not changed. but another loss now carried more weight. Waiting for confirmation started feeling risky. Closing early started feeling responsible, and this is why psychology advice always seemed to work for a while. I could remind myself to be patient, read the rules again, and take a few trades exactly as planned. The strategy did not need me to understand the lesson once. It needed me to stick to it at the exact moment the opposite decision felt safer, again and again, through different market conditions and different amounts of money. The longer I traded, the more chances I gave myself to eventually lose the argument. Imagine making the correct decision 20 times. You wait, you accept the loss, and you leave the trades alone. Then one position feels slightly different. You interfere once, and that single decision can erase the result of the previous 20. That was the part I had never really considered. My strategy could require hundreds of correct decisions to build an account, but one or two emotional decisions could destroy it. The system kept returning every important decision to me while money was on the line, and every time I did, fear or frustration received another opportunity to rewrite it. Looking back, most of those accounts were traded normally. Then one situation arrived where the pressure was high enough, and the version of me who wrote the rules had to argue with the version of me who wanted relief immediately. Sometimes the rule won, sometimes the feeling did, and I had built my entire trading around winning that argument forever. That was why every solution worked until I needed it most. And eventually, I started asking a different question. Why was I still arguing about decisions I had already made? I had spent years trying to become better at winning these arguments, but the strategy still depended on the best version of me showing up every time. And that person did show up, just not every day. So as long as every important decision stayed within reach, the version of me who had ruined the previous accounts would eventually receive another opportunity to make one. So eventually I stopped asking how to become better at winning the argument and started looking at where the argument kept happening. The first place was before the trade even existed. I would open the chart with a clear idea of what I was looking for. Then sit there watching price move around for hours. But the longer I watched, the more convincing everything started to look. A setup that was clearly too early when I first opened the chart would slowly become close enough. And eventually I would click. Afterward, I would look at the screenshot and wonder why I had taken something that was never inside the strategy. The mistake happened during the hours where I was waiting for the setup. So I stopped sitting there. I marked the area where something could become valid, set a trading view alert, and left the charts. When the alert went off, I came back and checked whether the setup was actually there. But even after a correct entry, I could still damage the trade. Price would move slightly against me, and suddenly the stop felt too close. Nothing had changed about the setup, but now I was watching money disappear, and the original decision felt harder to trust. Sometimes I would move my stops. Other times the trade would go into profit and I would close it early because giving any of that money back felt stupid. Then it would continue to the target without me. Eventually, the stop and target started going in immediately. The moment I entered, the trade already knew where it would end. I did not wait until the price moved against me to decide how much room it deserved, or until I saw profit to decide whether the original target still made sense. Those decisions were made before the trade had given me anything to protect. And that helped, but the same setup still felt different depending on the amount of money behind it. At a smaller size, I could leave the position alone. Then the risk increased, and suddenly every movement looked important. So I stopped showing myself the amount. And every time I removed one of those decisions, trading became quieter. I was no longer spending hours convincing myself not to enter, and the money was no longer sitting there trying to pull me out of the position. But parts of the process still depended on me clicking correctly. I could receive an alert and decide the setup did not look good enough today. So I started looking at which parts of the process were already clear enough that they did not need another live decision. If the entry conditions were completely defined, the risk was fixed, and where to exit was decided, there was no benefit in asking myself to approve them. Again, the thinking had already been done before the trade. The strategy was tested and I knew what needed to happen when the conditions appeared. And this did not happen all at once. Every predictable failure showed me other decision that should never have stayed available in the first place. And over time, my trading stopped depending on the best version of me showing up every day. But for a long time, automating those decisions felt like admitting defeat. I thought a real trader should be able to sit in front of the chart, feel the fear, watch the money move, and still make the correct decision manually every single time. Using alerts felt like avoiding patience. Letting an AI execute something I had already defined felt like I was no longer really trading. And part of me still wanted to prove that I could become that person. But writing a rule clear enough to automate it forced me to do the difficult work earlier. I had to test it, define exactly what qualified, and accept what the data said before real money started moving. So the discipline never left. It was being spent while I was calm enough to spend it properly. That was the part I had to understand for years. I thought discipline meant feeling the wrong impulse and defeating it every single time. But every time I relied on that, I gave the impulse another chance to win. And I only had to lose one of them badly enough to damage months of correct execution. So I stopped trying to prove that I could win forever. I made the important decisions when nothing was on the line, then made them difficult to change once something was. Now, if I changed the system, I knew I was changing it. My honest advice to traders who are still struggling is to look at the person who actually shows up after every losing streak. Build around that person. Make the important decisions before he reaches the You will still feel the fear, and the impatience will still be there, but the trade should still receive the decision you made when you were thinking clearly.